I'm not sure who needs to hear this, but saying that Black people were better off under slavery and Jim Crow because they committed less crimes is not a political opinion. Saying that Black women don't have equal cognitive functioning to white people, and if they are in high up positions, that must mean that they took a white person's slot, is not a political opinion. Believing that Black men who die because of police violence deserved it is not a political opinion. Saying that you don't believe 1 in 5 women are actually SA'd, so then 1 in 5 women must be lying, is not a political opinion. That is white supremacy and misogyny. And white supremacy and misogyny aren't political opinions. They're political violence.
I grew up under Jim Crow. When I was little, we couldn't go to certain places, like amusement parks. This photo is a true representation of how it was. These little girls couldn't go play because they were Black. This personally happened to me at a place called Fairyland Park, but they had one day set aside where Black people could attend. So in the neighborhood, they would call it the N-word day. And I know for a fact that my mother wasn't going to allow me to go because she was a proud woman. So my brother and his girlfriend swooped me up and took me to the Fairyland Park. People were protesting this park, and people were getting arrested. Of course, we didn't know any better because we were just kids and we wanted to have fun.
Okay, I'm just going to read these because I can't believe it. These are 5 real laws from the Jim Crow era that used to actually exist. I'm just going to read them. In the state of Alabama, it shall be unlawful to conduct a restaurant or other place of serving food at which white and colored people are served in the same room unless such white and colored persons are effectually separated by a solid partition extending from the floor upward to a distance of 7 feet or higher. In the state of Georgia, for burials, the officer in charge shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored person upon ground set apart or used for the burial of white people. Also in Georgia, for Little League Baseball, it shall be unlawful for any amateur white baseball team to play baseball on any vacant lot or baseball diamond within 2 blocks of a playground dedicated to the Negro race. This is for housing in Louisiana. Any person who rents any part of a building to a Negro person when there are already white people occupying said building shall go to jail for not less than 10 days and be convicted of a misdemeanor and pay a fine of $100. And in the great state of Missouri, all marriages between white persons and Negroes or white persons and Mongolians are prohibited and declared absolutely void. No person having 1/8 part or more of Negro blood shall be permitted to marry any white person, nor shall any white person be permitted to marry any Negro or person having 1/8 part more of Negro blood. Guys, these were laws not that long ago. The sad thing is, there are Black folks from a certain generation who would be completely unfazed to hear these because they remember a time when these were actual laws and they just lived through them. My grandma was born in the 30s and she absolutely grew up going to colored bathrooms and seeing whites only signs. So I've not said a lot about Roe v. Wade because quite frankly, I live in a trigger state and I am dealing with that. But I think it's important that we talk about things like Jim Crow laws and remember things like Jim Crow laws in these kind of political moments for a few reasons. I think it's important to remember what this country really used to be. I think it's important that we remember that just because something is a law does not necessarily make it right. And it's also a reminder that there is always hope. And just because something is a law now doesn't mean it always will be. When you fight like hell, justice will prevail. So anyway, y'all, abortion is healthcare. That's all I have to say. And now you've learned some more Black history. The more you know.
How did you feel about those Jim Crow laws at the time?
I didn't pay attention to it. There was nothing in the North. It was the South that had Jim Crow. We didn't pay attention to this stuff. Our schools were mixed and everything, and the teams were mixed, and it didn't affect us any. And besides that, I was too young to have any opinion anyhow. They were really ruthless.
In the South?
Southerners. There was an article in the paper, I don't know the town, but it was in the South, and this black guy was in shorts and a t-shirt, and he ran through a white neighborhood. Then three guys took after him. One of the guys shot him, killed him, and that was just for running through the neighborhood. And the trial just went a couple of weeks ago. These three guys were convicted of murder, and they'll spend their life in prison. That's the way Jim Crow was. It wasn't like that in the North. That was the South.
So where you lived, things were segregated, but people weren't as worried about
Nobody
the segregation?
by it. Yeah, I wasn't affected by it one way or the other. Howie Horn on the track team was black, and he was one of my best friends. Some football players, I can't remember their names, but Howie Horn I remember because he was on our championship relay team. I never even give it a thought when we were kids.
Seems like our country made a lot of progress with racism, and now it's all just gone
I
backwards.
don't think so. I don't think they ever made any progress.
Yeah.
The South has been pretty rough over the years. North, it's okay. Don't have any trouble in North. Above Mason-Dixon line, but they still have trouble in South. Just like these three guys running at this guy in a pickup just for running through the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Then they killed him.
It's
And
insane.
then, like I said, they spent the rest of their life in jail.
Yeah, as they should.
But at one time, they wouldn't even be arrested down south. One time they just shrugged it off.
Wow.
U.S. Representative Byron Donalds had something to say about Black families in the Jim Crow era. He was like, Black families thrived during the Jim Crow era. He was like, that was like the, pivotal point for Black families. We all stare in Black family staring. Like, excuse me, what now? And it was so interesting to watch this whole, thing unfold, transpire, whatever, because, they had him all up on the stage, and all of these people were just sitting there intently listening to everything he had to say while he sat there with his little glass of whiskey and his cigar and, just talking about all things Black. And, it's like, oh, you're such the representative of Black people and Black families, and talking about all the things Jim Crow era. Now let's talk about how you're going to talk about Black families and how they thrived during the Jim Crow era, and you don't even have a Black family. And it was, a good shout out to our good sis Joy Reid, who brought that up to him, and he was like, well, that no, my family would not be able to exist. He was like, but that's what I was saying. No. You sat there and perpetuated this foolishness in front of these people who are going to be potentially voting, because, let's not assume that all these people that go to these things are actually going to vote. That's just, it is reality. But you're talking about Black families thrive through the Jim Crow era, and you don't even have a Black family. So how do you know that they thrived? How do you, let's talk about the oppression. Let's talk about all the things that, split the Black family apart during this time. And here you are talking about the Black family, and you don't even have a Black family. Matter of fact, your family would not even be able to be allowed during the Jim Crow era, especially those early times, because his wife is Caucasian. And that's nothing against interracial, relationships, because, hey, back in my great-great-great-great-granddad times, a relationship happened, and hey, here we are. But then you also want to talk about, because that's when they were at their strongest. That was all the things. And then now people are starting to bring up the fact that you came from a single parent home. So how can you talk about the Black family structure when you did not have that? And this is not against anything against single parent families and all the things, because baby, y'all are out here doing it, okay? It is hard being a parent and then doing it by yourself. Hats off to you. But please do not get disenfranchised by these people who get up here and try to act like, oh, they're so pro-black and so all things black, and want to dissuade us from other things and say, oh, this was better. Because do you understand that if these people get into power, they're not going to...
Neurodivergent TikTok is racist as fuck. And I'm happy that I'm starting to see more black neurodivergent people post. But we tend to forget that black women are only appreciated and celebrated after they're gone. After we leave an area. After we leave a field. After we leave the discussion. Y'all sit here and you act like the healthcare system hasn't had an extensive history of murdering black bodies. Yet you expect black people to go through an evaluation process that costs thousands upon thousands of dollars just for a white, most likely white practitioner who does not understand you, your culture, your cultural implications, nothing about you, but to sit there and evaluate you and most likely give you a diagnosis that is incorrect, put you on medications that could end your life, all because you believe in these same systems that, like I said, kill black bodies. I have been trying to work my way through this book for months now, and it talks about an asylum that was up and running during the Jim Crow era in my home state of Maryland. The horrors that have happened to black people within the mental health care system, the horrors that have happened to me within the mental health care system, both working for the mental health care system and being a longtime patient, are unspeakable. Yet you still sit here and you uphold a system that kills black people. Like I said, black thought, black contribution, especially when it comes to black women, are not understood or appreciated until we're dead. Just let that sink in, okay?
What has black Americans not actually been through? What have black Americans not seen? And do you think that this Jim Crow's law did not still exist? They do exist. You can hear from the third clip that I played. It's sad. And that is why when I see some of these white women comment or say what they know that is fact, I really applaud them. Welcome back to the channel. If you have not subscribed, subscribe. Thank you so much for always coming to watch my videos. Thank you so much for my returning subscribers. This is just for educational purposes. Credit belongs to original creators of every clips and stitches we have in today's episode. And I'll just go ahead and roll out the clips I have for you guys. And then I'll be back with commentaries because, honestly, it's barbaric, to be honest. Anyways, guys, let's just dive right into this video. All hail black American people. Honestly, you guys are one of the most strongest people that I've ever seen and I've ever known.
People ask me, what was my aha moment? What made me change my perspective? And it's when I saw this. So a black person in the United States during the Jim Crow era faced second-class citizenship, disenfranchisement, barriers to voting, barriers to education, barriers to employment, and barriers to housing. Then we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which stated we could no longer do any of this. We could no longer discriminate based on race. So in 2023, what is the only group of people that we can legally discriminate against? We can legally relegate to second-class citizenship, create barriers to voting, barriers to education, barriers to employment, barriers to housing. If you answer convicted felon, you are absolutely correct. In 2023, a convicted felon is the only group of people that we can legally do all this to. Now, do you believe it's a coincidence that 1 in 3 black males carry this label as convicted felon as opposed to 1 in 17 white males? If you answered yes to that question, let's take a look at what's happened since the dismantling of the Jim Crow laws. We've had a 700% increase in our prison population. We've gone from 300,000 inmates to as high as 2.3 million. Now, I do believe we're back down to about 1.8 million today. We had the law and order agenda, which was an increase in police spending and a decrease in school funding, which created the school to prison pipeline. We also had the war on drugs, which we now know was a war on people. We had the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and we had the 1994 Crime Bill. Now, the 86 Anti-Drug Abuse Act differentiated between rock cocaine and powder cocaine, which we know predominantly impacted the black community. And the 94 Crime Bill created harsher sentences, lengthier sentences, and minimum mandatories. We also know that black people make up 53% of all exonerations, 69% of exonerations for drug crimes, and they're 7 times more likely to be wrongly convicted. So when I seen all of this, I realized that racism in this country never ended.
Historically, reparations are paid to those who have suffered injustice, often in the form of war, colonization, or systemic discrimination, the responsible party being the government. Here are a few of the common injustices inflicted on Black Americans that warrant restitution. Jim Crow laws limited job opportunities for Black people, often confining them to low-paying menial jobs. Other forms of Jim Crow laws, like segregation, enabled the ongoing dehumanization of Black people, which would enable lasting financial and psychological consequences on individuals. Violent mobs that destroyed prosperous Black communities throughout the U.S. were not limited to Black Wall Street. These tragedies resulted in the loss of lives, homes, and businesses. This obliterated accumulated wealth and erased future opportunities for wealth building. The fact that the perpetrators would never be brought to justice effectively reminded Black people of their status in society. Black families were denied loans, blocking home purchases in certain neighborhoods. This led to a significant racial wealth gap, as home ownership is a primary means of building wealth. Black codes were a series of laws that were enacted after slavery was abolished in order to restrict freedom and economic mobility, forcing Black Americans into exploitative labor arrangements and limiting their ability to build wealth. These injustices occurred all throughout the U.S., not just in the South. These are just a few examples of the way society hindered Black Americans from prospering in their own homeland, creating a cycle of poverty and economic disparity that would last for decades to come.
People are obsessed with race. Okay, let's talk about it. This country was founded on a racialized concept, which was that Europeans were preordained by God to rule the world, and that Africans ripped from their homes and transported across the transatlantic shores were destined to be their unpaid labor. That is the most important and defining feature of America at its inception, was a racial hierarchy whereby white men were at the top and Africans were at the bottom. Chattel slavery then lasted for nearly 250 years, ending in 1865. And during those 2.5 centuries, Black Americans were tortured. They were mentally and physically and sexually abused. They were murdered. They were forced to toil on land without being paid. They built these immense economies for America. They made America rich, but they didn't get any payment. The white people did. Once slavery ended, then we had the Black Codes, which were a series of discriminatory laws made precisely to perpetuate all of the systems and factors at play during enslavement. Black Codes severely limited the social, economic, political mobility of Black Americans, right? Black Americans really weren't able to own property. They weren't allowed to vote, really. They weren't able to testify against white people. They weren't able to serve on juries. They didn't really have any civil rights. And then there's the 13th Amendment, right? It abolished slavery, except for when someone was a criminal. And wouldn't you know, Black people were then criminalized for everything, thus enabling white people to re-enslave them. Next up, the Jim Crow laws, which restricted the mobility of Black Americans in public life in nearly every manner possible. And it lasted until the Civil Rights Movement. And wouldn't you know, Black people weren't actually enfranchised to vote until 1965. But it's not about race. And next up, we have redlining, whereby financial institutions like banks refuse to provide financial services like mortgages to Black people. Then we have mass incarceration, which is essentially a reimagination of slavery. I know you know that Black Americans are disproportionately incarcerated by both the state and the federal government, that they are overrepresented at every stage of the criminal legal system. Black people are treated like absolute shit in the criminal legal system. First of all, there are nearly 2 million people incarcerated in the United States, which is horrific and abysmal. 37% of those people are Black Americans, even though Black people only represent 13% of the American population. Black people across the board get worse plea deals, they get harsher sentencings, they get much higher bail, and they face disproportionate prejudice and discrimination from judges, from the prosecutors, and from the juries. But it's not about race. Then all of these tentacles of racism and discrimination and prejudice then reach into every other part of American life and infect it, right? Like, for example, have you seen our political system? Enough said there. Black people have less access to college and have less avenues to get there. The wealth gap between the median Black household and the median white household is $240,000, which means for every $100 of wealth that a white household has, a Black household only has $15. Black people face disproportionately negative outcomes in healthcare, and the maternal death rates for Black women are insane and abysmal. Black people are promoted much less readily by their employers, and only 1.6% of the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies are Black people. Black people are disproportionately surveilled, arrested, and killed by the police. But it's not about race. So the next time you come in my comments and ask me why I talk about race so much, or you go somewhere else, not everything's about race. I'd encourage you to watch this video like 5 times and then send it to your racist family members and then get back to me.
Jim Crow happened approximately 150 years ago in the 1870s. So how can I speak on it when I didn't live it? I also can't speak on what happened since then, just what happened within my lifetime. 1870? Try 1965, friend. And legalized discrimination lasted until 1968 with redlining. And of course, despite outlawing legalized segregation, the effects remain, causing things like food apartheid, educational disparities, and disproportional policing, among many other things. Not to mention, when has making something illegal ever stopped people from doing that thing? Did everyone stop drinking alcohol when the 18th Amendment was passed? No, they created an underground market and found a way to drink. The same is true with racism. It evolves every time there's a new law or light shown on one aspect of the system. And this is where, if you knew your history, you could speak on what's actually happening right now. And one of the ways racism is happening right now is with states banning CRT from being taught in schools. Let's be very clear. Critical race theory has never been taught in public schools in the United States. What they're banning is the teaching of Black history. When people intentionally deny and villainize the teaching of history, especially the history of the people your country's been responsible for oppressing, what do you think that gives them license to do? Repeat that shit over and over and over again. At the time I'm making this video, 18 states have banned the teaching of Black history under the guise of CRT. And now a whole new generation of white folks will have no idea what they're talking about, which will cause them to become the next part of the machine that gaslights the lived experience and history of Black folks in this country.
The definition of Jim Crow, just so we all know what we're talking about. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. They existed essentially from the post-Civil War era. They were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, and other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. Now I want to talk about something that happened during this era. You said that what you were talking about was the presence of the Black father in the home to protect his wife and family. In 1943, in the state that you represent, in Florida, a young man named Willie James Howard, who was 15 years old, was lynched. During Christmas of 1943, Willie Howard sent cards to all of his coworkers at the Van Priest dime store in Live Oak, Florida. Unlike the other cards, Willie's card to Cynthia Goff, a white store employee, revealed a youthful crush. His greeting expressed hope that white people would someday like Black people and concluded, "I love your name, I love your voice. For SH, sweetheart, you are my choice." After reading the card, Cynthia's father, Phil Goff, brought 2 friends to the Howard home and demanded to see Willie. Despite his mother's pleading, the men dragged Willie away and then kidnapped Willie's father, James Howard, from work. The men drove the 2 Howards, I should say, to the embankment of the Suwannee River, bound Willie's hands and feet, stood him at the edge of the water, and told him to either jump or be shot. Willie jumped into the cold water below and drowned while his father was forced to watch at gunpoint. Willie's dead body was pulled from the river the next day. You said that during the Jim Crow era, the importance of having a Black man in the home was to protect his family and to protect his wife. I actually spoke with somebody who lived through Jim Crow. Her name is Merle Evers Williams. And Merle quoted to me a man named Charles Silverman, who wrote in Crisis in Black and White, that in 1890, the year that the Mississippi Constitution was written, the policy of crushing out the manhood of the Negro citizens was to be carried out with success. So the man in the home during Jim Crow had no rights, could not protect his wife from rape, could not protect his son from lynching. So again, why would you quote that era and say that at that time, the family all being in the home together was something we should think.
Welcome back, guys. That is all the clips that I have for you guys, and I hope you guys actually watched that clip. Please be dropping your comments for me in the comment section, because that is one place where we interact and learn from each other. You guys already know that this is just for educational purpose, right? And I also went ahead and do some of my research, and of which I'm going to be reading out what I have here. And before I get into conclusion, I think it's been long we did some research readings, right? So I just researched about the disadvantage of the Jim Crow law in the US, especially for Black Americans. And these are my results. So you can also be checking yours so that you know that we are on the same spot, right? The Jim Crow law in the United States, late 19th century to the mid 20th century, were a system of legalized racial segregation and discrimination. They were especially harmful to Black Americans, creating deep disadvantage in most every area of life. Some major disadvantages include denial of equal education. Black children were forced into unfunded, segregated schools with fewer resources, poor facilities, and limited opportunities compared to the white schools. This reinforced generational poverty and reduced chances for social mobilities. Economic discrimination. Black workers were often restricted to low-paying, dangerous, or minor jobs. Law and social practice blocked them from many professionals, unions, and fair wages. Land ownership and access to loans and systematic denied. The third one is political disenfranchisement. Through polls, taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and violence, Black Americans were effectively banned from voting. This meant they had no real political power to fight back against the system. Segregation in public life. Black Americans were forced to use separate and inferior public facility, transportation, hospitals, restaurants, and housings. Signs reading white only and colored were daily reminders of exclusion and second-class citizenship. Legal injustice and violence. Courts and law enforcement were biased against Black Americans, rarely protecting their rights. Lynching, police brutality, and racial violence were widespread, often with no punishment for perpetrators. It's still happening till date, so you can know. Physiological and social harm. Jim Crow's law reinforced the ideas that Black Americans were less than white. Constant humiliation, discrimination, and exclusion caused long-lasting trauma and reinforced systematic racism. In short, Jim Crow's law denied Black Americans their basic human rights, equality, dignity, and opportunities, trapping generations in cycles of poverty and discrimination.
The Jim Crow laws in the United States, late 19th century to mid-20th century, were a system of legalized racial segregation and discrimination. They were especially harmful to Black Americans, creating deep disadvantages in almost every area of life. Some major disadvantages include 1. Denial of equal education. Black children were forced into underfunded, segregated schools with fewer resources, poor facilities, and limited opportunities compared to white schools. This reinforced generational poverty and reduced chances for social mobility. 2. Economic discrimination. Black workers were often restricted to low-paying, dangerous, or menial jobs. Laws and social practices blocked them from many professions, unions, and fair wages. Land ownership and access to loans were systematically denied. 3. Political disenfranchisement. Through poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and violence, black Americans were effectively barred from voting. This meant they had no real political power to fight back against the system. 4. Segregation in public life. Black Americans were forced to use separate and inferior public facilities, transportation, hospitals, restaurants, and housing. Signs reading whites only and colored were daily reminders of exclusion and second-class citizenship. 5. Legal injustice and violence. Courts and law enforcement were biased against black Americans, rarely protecting their rights. Lynching, police brutality, and racial violence were widespread, often with no punishment for perpetrators. 6. Psychological and social harm. Jim Crow laws reinforced the idea that black Americans were less than whites. Constant humiliation, discrimination, and exclusion caused long-lasting trauma and reinforced systemic racism. In short, Jim Crow laws denied black Americans their basic human rights, equality, dignity, and opportunities, trapping generations in cycles of poverty and discrimination. Would you like me to also give you examples of specific Jim Crow laws that clearly show these disadvantages?
It is well. Do you know I actually played that? I actually have to replay it because some persons told me specifically that whenever I read out some of my research, I should be able to play it so that they can understand better. And I hope you guys understand better. But all I have to say is just be safe out there. If you're a black American, I love you from the depth of my heart. And this is me sending you love and kisses and hugs, right? Anyway, subscribe, like, comment, and share. Let me know what you think in the comment section. This is just for educational purpose, not to bash anyone. And every clips used in today's episode credit belongs to original creators of those videos. And I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye for now. I love you. Mwah.